Okay, we're going to continue with the series of how to build a billion-dollar startup almost overnight. And being a complexity scientist, one of the things that I'll, of course, always look for is patterns. And one of the patterns that I've noticed lately, and actually it was spurred by the Rolling Stones, and we'll discuss that, is called what I call the anti-market pattern. And so what happens is, if you have a market, so let's say, obviously we talked about the different curves, so if you have an emerging market and it's growing, one of the things that happens is as the market gains dominance, there's a beginning, this is a beginning what I call an anti-market, okay? So initially you don't see this part, okay? So this is the part that you don't see, but you can look at it from a mental framework perspective that whatever market is expanding very quickly, there is a market, anti-market, that's going to run against it. And then the evolution of the market and anti-market is going to play out in very different and interesting ways. So what happens is, let's say like example, social media, you've got Facebook that went in and came in, okay, and just completely exploded. Obviously MySpace and some of the other ones were first, but what Facebook did was they went from this the innovation stage and an early adopter stage and started expanding into a market. Some of the anti-markets came into play, and you can look at, for instance, Twitter as an anti-version of Facebook to some extent. Of course, Twitter is developing an interest graph and Facebook is developing a social graph, but maybe a better example of the anti-market to some extent is LinkedIn, because Facebook is focused on developing a social graph on an individual basis. From a personal perspective, but how I see it is LinkedIn is developing a social graph from a career or business perspective. So you could look at those things as mirroring each other, and in fact, in my opinion, LinkedIn has a much more powerful business model than Facebook, but that's open to debate. So what happens is at some point, as the market, and I call it market A, comes into play, there's some point where something happens in the marketplace which enables the anti-market to come into play. And so usually what happens is the anti-market starts coming in and starts expanding in a parallel fashion to the main market. And you may not see it at first because it's still small, okay? But then it starts exploding. And so what happens is as it goes this way around, and as the emerging market starts going mainstream, then what happens is you have a couple inflection points. One of them is going this way. So really what happens then is that the anti-market ends up being expanding at the same rate as possibly as the main market, so they kind of parallel each other. Okay, perfect example of that is from my perspective, is the Coke versus Pepsi scenario. So for instance, Coke, if you look at the history of Coke, it was always positioned as, you know, old-fashioned, classic, yada, yada, yada. And then Pepsi always targeted the young generation. So you could look at Coke as a traditional, older generation versus Pepsi that is targeted to the young generation. And the simplest way to do it is through the product. When you compare Coke to Pepsi, Pepsi is much sweeter, so from that perspective it's going to appeal to the younger demographics, and that's one of the reasons why you see Pepsi always appealing to the new generation. So you could, from that perspective, look at Coke versus Pepsi as a main market and anti-market. Now there's a couple things and couple themes that come into play here is when you're talking about anti-markets. First of all, one way to look at it is like anti-establishment. So, you know, if there's a norm or traditional norm or something set in place, the easiest way to go against the grain is to go against the establishment. So that's anti-establishment. And I think a perfect place of that is the concept of money, today's money, and Bitcoin. One of the reasons why Bitcoin has become so successful, in my opinion, and why it's exploded and created a lot of controversy is because it's going against the principles of anti-establishment. Using the principles of anti-establishment. So that's a perfect example of anti-establishment. Another way to look at it is like anti-market is in terms of anti-product, or anti-service. And a good example was obviously Coke versus Pepsi, okay? But I have to tell you that one of the greatest examples of the anti-markets is the Beatles against the Rolling Stones. And I can tell you, I don't think I've ever met in my life someone that likes Beatles but also likes the Rolling Stones. It just doesn't work. In fact, I was watching one of the documentaries on the Rolling Stones on HBO, and they talked about it. The Beatles was the establishment, the traditional, and you know, the goody-goody. And then here comes the anti-establishment, anti-Beatles, the great Rolling Stones. And so it's actually a great documentary that goes through the trials and tribulations of Rolling Stones becoming the greatest rock and roll band of all times. But what I found very interesting about it is that they created a differentiation point by being anti-Beatle. Now, they were not against anti-Beatles themselves, but the market, the media, the positioning of it ended up being like it. Of course, being bad boys that they were, that in itself created the anti-establishment, anti-Beatle feel to it. Another way to look at it is, like, for instance, what you're going to see, in my opinion, over the next 5 years is the anti-social products. Because in today's environment, share everything, okay? I think it's going to hit an inflection point where people, in my opinion, are just tired of sharing everything, or will tire of sharing everything. And also privacy, obviously, is becoming a huge issue. So you're going to see the anti-social market services and products come into play big time. In fact, in my opinion, privacy, okay? Privacy is obviously, if you think about it, sharing, okay, versus privacy is big. And, you know, in the emerging markets of social media, because it's so exciting and people are excited about sharing, there's going to come a point where the anti-market comes into play, where privacy becomes as important as sharing. And that usually happens as the markets go mainstream, because depending on the demographics, you're going to have it play out where older people prefer to stay more private, okay? And as Facebook has become mainstream, it's attracting those older demographics, so there becomes an issue of privacy. So it comes down to sharing and privacy, and that's going to come into play even more. So one of the other things that can happen is that as the anti-market expands, okay, the main market may actually slow down or even go down. So those are the scenarios and the patterns where you kind of can't predict. You got to watch the markets, and I said in some of the other videos is you got to know how to ride and surf them and watch those patterns. I think another way to look at it is, like, for instance, if you have a product today, okay, how do you convert it into a service? So what's happened is that cloud computing, okay, has become a huge opportunity for companies. And you know, the days of, for instance, having your software application on your computer are, you know, gone. I mean, everything is going into the cloud, where you can access your applications on the servers in the cloud. And so, of course, that's a huge opportunity, and cloud computing has become a very big business. One of the last examples I want to show you is the concept of lean production, okay, versus mass production. Okay, so what's happened is that in the old days, when the automobile industry came into its emergence, Henry Ford became a billionaire almost overnight because he standardized the process of mass production. So what you could do is, and he created a continuous flow in the production. He standardized all the features, and of course he standardized the design, so you could have any Ford you want as long as it was black. And that made him very successful. And the reason that happened was because the markets in America were large and homogeneous. Now, the anti-thinking to mass production is, in America it's called lean production. In Japan, obviously, it's called the Toyota production system, invented by Taiichi Ohno. And here, it's really talking about, you know, enabling the customer to buy any part or product they want at the time they want. Okay, so just-in-time production is obviously a component of it. So in the lean production system, you basically make parts when the customer wants it, to summarize it for you simply. And so mass production, with its large volume batch and queue type of thinking, is basically a subset of lean production. So if you look at it that way, you can see that the process, you can look at even not only a product, a service, but you can also look at a process and say, okay, if it's done this way, how can I do it a different way? And also that's a way of thinking in reverse, and that's one of the key components of lean production, which is you're actually thinking backwards. And so when you look at these different components of this, you can see that market A obviously is going to at some point compete against market Z. And so now how it plays out, as I said in summaries, it really depends. The market may expand, and certain customers will want the traditional market, just like you have certain customers that want a traditional Coke. And then you have other ones that want to buy Pepsi, depending on their demographics. And of course, there's all kinds of other things that play out. And so what happened was, if you look at it another way, you can look at different types of product categories. And so what happened was two categories completely ended up being anti-markets, okay, to the soft drink beverage. And one of them is the energy drinks, okay, sector. That's a huge billion-dollar sector. And of course, the other one was the water. I can tell you in my younger days, when bottled water was still not mainstream in America, I used to go around and tell people, hey, bottled water is going to be big. And I was just in my 20s in college, and people look at me like I was strange, but okay. So bottled water became big, and of course energy drinks came in, injected more caffeine, and made it much more energy driven. So these two markets, if you look at the soft drink market, were really, if you think about it, anti-markets. They weren't really anti-products, they were really anti-markets, because in the energy drink you got Monster, okay, and of course Red Bull created the whole thing, and now you've got Rockstar, and you got all kinds of energy drinks. And even with this, within the energy drink market, you have now subcategories. The same thing with water. You know, when the bottled water became a huge market, anti-market to the soft drinks, and actually water itself, it evolved into where you have bottled water with certain ingredients and flavors. So this just shows you to think in anti-market. So if you want to build a billion-dollar startup almost overnight, this is another way for you to look at the market patterns. Look, if you're seeing a market, ask yourself, hey, what's the opposite of this? If you see a product that's successful, ask yourself, what's the opposite of this product or service? And of course, the main thing I want to bring about is, from a mental framework perspective, is to think in reverse, or think in the opposite direction. I always used to say, if people are going left, try to go right. If people are going right, try to go left. Now, there is difficulty in that, because if you're dealing with anti-markets, okay, the traction, okay, is going to depend. For me to tell you at what point does the anti-market coexist with the market, or the main market, it's really category specific, product specific. So my point is that what you have to do when you're going in the anti-direction, you really have to have the psychology of the entrepreneur mind come into play, where you got to ride that because you're going against the grain. And there's going to be a point where going against the grain is not so hard, and the resistance, the market inertia is decreased substantially, where you can jump on, ride parallel as the opposite example, and expand. So those are the lessons I've learned being a complexity scientist and watching these patterns play out, as you can tell, in various type of industries. But the best example for you is the Rolling Stones.